So without further ado, let me turn the floor over to PBPC Director Marc Stier. He's going to start the presentation, and then he will turn it over to Diana Polson for some portions of it as well. And then, like I said, we'll do Q&A at the very end. So thanks for joining us. And Marc, let me turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, John. All right, that's the title. Let's go on to the next slide. That's who we are. Next slide. And now I'm going to begin with our analysis of the governor's budget. I want to start with basically two preliminary points. The second one will take us into some details on the revenue side of the budget. But they're both designed to set the stage for our analysis of this budget. The governor's proposed a budget that in many ways is austere, that doesn't have a broad tax increase, that makes some selective investments in certain things, education, higher education, workforce development training, a couple of human service areas, but in many ways isn't sufficient to meet the needs that we see in the state. And I think the first thing we should say about this budget is that he's done this largely because of the limits of politics in our state. There's some very serious conflicts in Harrisburg because of who holds the control of the General Assembly and who sits in the governor's seat. And we should understand that any budget proposal in this context is going to be limited by that conflict. Basically, the conflict is, I think many of you understand, is that we have two very different views of government presented in Harrisburg. One sees government as critical to creating broadly shared prosperity. It believes in investments in workforce training and education and human services and infrastructure and protecting the environment are all critical to making life good for Pennsylvanians, to creating broadly shared prosperity, to making our communities thrive. The other view has one or two answers to any public problem: cut government and cut taxes. And these two views are really radically in conflict. And let me make clear, this is not a partisan conflict. There are a lot of people among Democrats and Republicans who believe this first common sense view, who understand that government has a real important role to play in making communities thrive and creating prosperity. It's not just Democrats who think this, there are a lot of Republicans who think this as well. On the other side, they're mostly Republicans who have this extreme view that the only important thing to be doing in Harrisburg is cutting government taxes. But there are actually a couple of Democrats who believe that as well. So it's not a partisan divide. It's really a divide between people who, from our point of view, really, are taking a common sense position that grows out of real experience in local politics and local community efforts, and understand that, if you don't get a bridge built, your community suffers. If you don't educate your kids, they can't get good jobs. If you don't train your workers, businesses won't come. And it's on the one side, and on the other side, it's very ideological view that just, sees government as totally the problem and as never contributing to our prosperity and to making communities good places to live. Unfortunately, this ideological right-wing view, which is held by only a minority of folks in the General Assembly, does have the power to say no to budget progress. And we've seen that over the last 3 years. The majority of the majority party in the House of Representatives, controlled by Speaker Terzai and Majority Leader Dave Reed, may be a minority of the General Assembly as a whole, but they control the floor. They control whether legislation, including appropriations bills and tax bills, can come to the floor. And they simply won't allow appropriations bills and tax bills that really will meet the needs of Pennsylvania to come to the floor. So they have this tremendous power just in saying no. And we've seen over the last 3 years that even when the governor can make a bipartisan deal in the Senate, and he's done that over and over again on spending plans and on taxing plans, that the majority party in the House can block those proposals. And they're willing to block those proposals. They're willing to say no, no matter what. Even if the Republican Senate president says that what's going on in the House is an embarrassment, that doesn't faze them. And this is a pretty abnormal situation for Pennsylvania politics, but it's one that everyone who works in the government in Harrisburg, from the governor on down, has to take account of. And that's, in many ways, what shapes our budget politics. The governor is trying to present a budget that can get adopted, and he doesn't have control over that. He has to work with that right-wing minority that does have the power to say no. And that I think is the most important context of this budget, politically. Ultimately, it's up to Pennsylvanians to choose which way we're going to go and to break the logjam. No one in Harrisburg can break that logjam. It really has to be up to the voters to decide, well, we're going to move one direction or another. With that as the first context, let's go on to a second context. Next slide. And that's the structural deficit we've talked about over the last 3 years. To remind you, a structural deficit simply means that revenues under current law don't bring in enough, are not enough to support the services provided under current law and under federal law. The money that comes in under the current tax system is not enough to provide the same services this year as we did the last year, and the services that are required under state laws and under federal mandates for such federal state programs as Medicaid. Now, we've faced a structural deficit every year since the Great Recession. And while we don't face one this year, I think looking at where it came from and why it may be temporarily gone is a really good context to understand what's going on in this budget. So we're going to talk a little bit about where the structural deficit came from and how this budget proposes to deal with it next year and in future years. Next slide. First, we're going to talk about some of the long-term sources of the structural deficit, and then we'll look at some of the short-term ones. So let's go into the next slide. Here's just a quick overview of the revenues we're facing. Where the revenues are coming from in the 2018-2019 budget. You'll see much of it comes from the personal income tax. A lot of it comes from the sales tax, and then other taxes are a smaller amount. Business taxes and corporate income taxes make only 15% of general fund revenues, and that really is the first answer to where our part of our problem is. But before I get to that, let's just look at the next slide. And I want to point out that the one thing that the right-wing ideologues always say about our budget is simply not true. They say we have a structural deficit because we are spending too much. The fact is we are not spending too much. This chart traces, or we're not spending more. Whether it's too much or too little is a different question. Spending has not been going up. If you look at this chart, it shows that spending as a share of the gross state product has declined from roughly 5% down to almost 4%. Next slide. You can see that between 1997 and 2011, expenditures averaged about 4.66% of gross state product. During the COVID years, they dropped to 4.25%. In the first 3 Wolf budgets, they dropped again to 4.23%. In the budget the governor's proposed for 2018-2019, it drops even further to 4.17%. And in the governor's projections from 2020 to 2023, it drops to 4.09%. Now, that is to say, he's projecting a 12% reduction in spending compared to the 1997 to 2011 average as a percent of gross state product. So it's simply not correct to say spending has been increasing in the state. as a share of gross state product, it's been actually declining. And that takes into account the growing economy and the growing needs that are associated with the growing economy, and also population growth. Obviously, as an absolute amount, the budget goes up a little bit every year, but in terms of how much of the economy the budget takes up, the really relevant question is what's its share of the gross state product? And here we can see it's actually been declining. So that's not the explanation. Go on to the next slide, please. What is the first of the long-term explanations is that corporate taxes are providing a smaller share of general fund revenue over time. We saw before that right now, in the proposed budget for next year, corporate taxes make up only 15% of state revenues. Well, if you go back to 1972, they made up 30% of state revenues. And even in the late 90s, they were around 22% of state revenues. Now, that has been incredibly costly in terms of state revenues. As we've been cutting corporate taxes, we've been losing significant revenues every year. And the next slide shows us just how serious this problem is. If we hadn't cut corporate taxes at the rate we had, we would have almost $4 billion more to spend in 2018, 2019. And think about it for a minute. If we had another $4 billion to spend next year, it means we'd have about $3.7 billion more to spend this year. We wouldn't be talking about structural deficits. We'd be talking about where do we want to invest the revenues that are coming in public services and things like infrastructure, education, or human services. So the biggest reason why we face structural deficits in recent years is we've had these pretty massive corporate tax cuts. Next slide. A second reason we face these big structural deficits is we have an upside-down tax system. We've talked about this many times over the years, so I'm going to be brief, but basically our situation in Pennsylvania is that we take a much larger share of income of folks with low income than of folks with high income. In the bottom 20%, people pay 12% of their income in state and local taxes. The middle 20% of households, people pay 10.3% of their income in state and local taxes. The top 1% only pay 4.2% of their income in state and local taxes. Now, that's problematic for two reasons. One, we think it's unfair. Every state around us has a much flatter system in which pretty much everyone pays around the same percentage of their income in taxes. But leave aside the fairness issue, there's another issue. We all know that incomes have been going up for people at the top of the income scale and have been really stagnant for people in the bottom 99%. Now think about it. If you don't tax the people whose incomes are going up, you will find that you're not bringing in enough money to pay for government services, that your taxes won't keep pace with the growth in the economy because the people who are doing well in that growing economy aren't paying more every year, while the people who are paying who pay the most don't see their incomes increase. So that's the second source of our long-term structural deficit, our upside-down tax system. Next slide. There's another long-term problem, and that is that the population in Pennsylvania is aging. And I'm just going to briefly mention it. It's not as big as the first two problems. There's the issue that as people get older, they spend more money on services than goods, but our sales tax exempts most services but taxes goods. So, for example, if you're buying washing machines and dryers and dishwashers and thinking big things, or clothing, you're paying a sales tax. If you're mostly getting services, people coming in to take care of you, you're not paying a sales tax. And as people get older, they pay more for services and less for goods. And so again, our sales tax doesn't keep up with the growing economy in the state because we're not taxing everything people purchase. And it's not just about aging. As the economy grows, we're spending more on entertainment services, say, and less on goods. Cars, computers aren't that much more expensive year after year. Entertainment is much more expensive, and we're not taxing things like entertainment, where more and more of our money is spent, particularly for middle and upper middle income and wealthy people. Now, so that's the three long-term sources of the budget deficit: corporate tax cuts, upside-down tax system, and that we don't tax services at the same rate we tax goods with the sales tax. Now let's quickly look at some of the short-term sources of structural deficit. One is that we've recovered slowly from the recession in Pennsylvania. There are a lot of reasons for that. One actually is we haven't raised the minimum wage, which every state around us has done, and which has resulted in those states growing faster than Pennsylvania. A second is something that affected us last year. The prospect of a federal tax cut led people to delay income, particularly capital income, in 2016, and that led to slow income growth last year. It's increasing this year, so we have less of a problem in terms of state tax revenues. And then the third issue is that we've been balancing budgets with one-year revenues year after year. Instead of dealing with the structural deficit, instead of saying, okay, the tax system is not bringing enough money, we need to fix it, we need to find some replacement for those corporate tax cuts or roll them back, we've been shifting payments later and receipts earlier to balance the budget. We've been borrowing from special funds. We've been borrowing on the basis of anticipated revenues. Last year, we did a $1.5 billion bond issue based on tobacco settlement money to close the deficit that had been run up the previous year. We've been selling licenses for gaming expansion or for liquor sale expansion. And whether you think gaming or liquor sale expansion is a good idea or a bad idea, and we at PBPC think we've been doing too much of it, the issue still remains that the money you bring in is one-time revenues. That you get the license fees 1 year, and then you don't get additional revenues the following years. So those are the short-term sources of the structural deficit. Let's go to the next slide. Last fall, we expected an almost $1 billion deficit for the year beginning July 1st. That's 2018, 2019. And we expected deficits in the future. The governor's budget projects that we won't have a deficit next year, and we won't have deficit in future years. So let's see what's changed. Next slide. How does government will project balanced budgets? Well, in the short term, 2018, 2019, there are three major reasons why that $1 billion structural deficit has disappeared. One is that there's been significant spending restraint. Last year, we saw a lot of reforms and restructuring of the government. Not everything the governor wanted, but we've seen consolidation of departmental services, some reduction in the number of state workers, all done through attrition, reduced state leasing of spaces as offices have been consolidated around the state. All that stuff has enabled the governor to slow the growth of spending and flat fund many areas of the government. We've also seen very effective management of the Medicaid system, and that's one of the biggest areas of spending for the state, both in helping people with health care and giving them long-term care. There's been some very effective management of how we spend the money through the medical managed care organizations and through the new long-term care proposals that create managed care systems for people who are seniors and need help. And then there's been some short-term funds that have been available this year, in particular, to keep Medicaid spending down. A second reason the governor could balance the budget next year is that tax revenues have been coming in more strongly, and so we can expect that more revenues will be available to balance the budget. And third, there are some new revenues projected in the 2018-2019 budget. In particular, the governor calls for $248 million from a new severance tax and $63 million from a tax on communities that rely on the state police to provide local policing services. So those are the two main revenue sources next year. Over the long term, the governor can project balanced budgets for two reasons. One is the increases in pension spending is leveling off. As many of you know, we have had a big unfunded debt, and that unfunded debt largely came about because the state wasn't meeting its annually required contributions to either the PSERS or the SERS pension systems. In the last 3 years, we've met the PSERS actual requirement, that is including the budget for next year. And if the governor's proposal is accepted, we will have met the SERS requirement for the second year. That's required much larger contributions to pension spending. But the result is, on the one hand, those contributions won't be growing that much faster. We've kind of reached the plateau we need to be at. And second, the unfunded debt is now being retired. And it'll be totally retired from the PSERS system by 2035 and for the SERS system by 2040. And that's the public employees and the school employee systems, PSERS and SERS. The other big thing that hasn't been widely noted is that Governor Wolf's budget projects serious corporate tax reform. We've talked about the Delaware loophole, and I'm not going to stop now and explain that, but we're happy to do it in the questions. But the Delaware loophole is finally going to be closed by a move to combined reporting under the governor's proposal. That will allow a slow reduction in the corporate tax rate from 9.9% to 7.9%. But combined reporting in the initial years, before that rate drops down too far, will bring in almost $1 billion more per year into the state coffers. And that's a major help in reducing the long-term structural deficit. Even when the rate comes down, the corporate income tax will be bringing in somewhere between $300 and $600 million a year additionally. And given that so much of the problem of the structural deficit is that we've cut corporate taxes, we at PBPC think that this is a really important proposal. We think it's the right way to reduce the structural deficit by raising corporate income tax revenues, while also reducing the rates. Under this combined reporting proposal, we will be able to stop saying that 71% of corporations operating in Pennsylvania don't pay any corporate taxes, because everyone will be paying their fair share, even if the rates come down for everyone, and that'll bring in a lot more money. So that's the second context and for understanding this budget, that the structural deficit, at least as the government proposes, is going to be a problem of the past. But there is a question is, can we totally count on this? So let's go to the next slide. I want to point out that there are some areas where there are concerns that we might have about whether this goal can actually be totally met. There's some short-term reasons for concern. 2018-2019 relies on $500 million of non-recurring revenues, gaming expansion, and also some revenue from a managed care gross receipts tax, which the federal government has ruled we can't collect anymore. So we'll have it for 2018-2019. The question is, how will we make up that money in future years? And then there's some long-term reasons for concern as well. Can we count on the General Assembly enacting the corporate tax reform and severance tax? If they don't, we will be talking about structural deficits again next year. And then there's also the threat of a recession. The governor has finally called on the General Assembly to put aside money in a rainy day fund, but it's going to take time for that rainy day fund to accumulate. And the governor's only proposing a small contribution next year and slightly growing contributions in future years. If we were to hit a recession and state revenues drop by $500 million or more, then we'd be back into a situation where we have a structural deficit again. So I think the governor should be commended for moving the state in a direction that's reduced the structural deficit. and made it possible to imagine a future where we don't have to deal with it and started discussions of the budget every year by talking about a structural deficit. But there still is some reason to be worried that the steps the General Assembly has to take to eliminate the structural deficit won't be taken, and that if a recession were to occur, we'd be back talking about it again. Next slide. I want to just talk about some of the general fund expenditures and, as a whole, and then I'm going to turn the presentation over to Diana to talk about a couple of particular areas. Next slide. The governor's proposed budget increases spending by 3.09%, a small increase from the previous year. Total budget's about $33 billion. Next slide. As usual, the biggest spending areas are pre-K to 12 education and medical assistance and long-term living. Human services and corrections are two other big areas of spending. We continue to spend more for corrections than we do for higher education, unfortunately. Someday I hope I can stop saying that in these presentations. Next slide. There's about a $1 billion increase in spending. Partly it's mandatory increases of about $685 million, and then partly about $300 million of new programmatic initiatives. Next slide. The mandatory increases, and these are areas where the state has to spend more given federal state law or contracts with state employees or those who provide services to government, are pensions and medical assistance, and then other areas of the budget where wage and government provider costs have been going up. Next slide. Here's where the new initiatives proposed by the governor. They're for education, community economic development, human services, some for police, state police, and a few other areas. I'm going to stop here now, and I'm going to have Diana talk in detail about these new initiatives, particularly with regard to education and human services. And then I'll come back at the end and wrap it up.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Next slide, John. So Mark has given you an overview of the governor's proposed budget, and I'm going to walk you through some of the specifics for education and human services, which combined make up almost 3/4 of general fund spending. I'll also talk a little bit about the governor's focus on workforce development. So just as some background and context for folks who aren't that familiar with K-12 education funding in Pennsylvania, the state government shares responsibility for funding K-12 schools with 500 local school districts. So state funds supplement funds raised locally, primarily through property taxes. But it's important to note that compared to other states, Pennsylvania provides a comparatively low share of total K-12 funding in the state. Only 37% of this funding comes from the state compared to the national average of 47%. So this has led to school districts having to rely heavily on local property taxes. And as you can imagine, this has resulted in disparities between school districts that have a strong tax base and those who do not. In fact, in 2015, Pennsylvania ranked worst out of all 50 states for disparities between rich and poor school districts, with the state's poorest districts spending 33% less per student than in the wealthiest. Also, as many of you know, when Governor Corbett was in office, he took a hatchet to much of the education budget. So given this context, Governor Wolf has prioritized education funding in his previous 3 budgets. And this year, he's done the same. Next slide. So let me first go over some highlights of the governor's education budget. He proposes increases in basic education funding, early childhood education, special education, and the state system of higher education. He also proposed some increases in career and technical education, but I'll talk more about that later when I discuss workforce development. Next slide. So we at the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center analyze education funding in two primary ways. The first way is to look at overall spending on pre-K through 12. So this is what this chart shows. These education numbers include the whole pre-K to 12 budget, which includes things like pensions and transportation. So this graph shows that overall education funding going back to 2010 and 11, and this year the governor has proposed a 5.1% increase in education funding from last year. Next slide. So the second way we look at education funding is by looking specifically at what we call classroom funding, which is the funding provided to local school districts to fund classroom education. So this chart shows that after 8 long years, the drastic budget cuts from then Governor Corbett would finally be restored under Governor Wolf's proposal this year. Although I do have to mention that while this is an important win to have restored these cuts, these amounts are nominal dollars and doesn't take into account inflation. And inflation over these 8 years would be about 15%. Next slide. So another way to look at classroom funding is to look at the yearly change, which this chart does. So if you were to add up the yearly change of all the blue bars, you would get $876 million, which finally surpassed the cuts from 2011-12. Next slide. So the largest line item in the K through 12 education budget is called the basic education subsidy. And as I mentioned earlier, the governor proposed to increase this by $100 million this year. So as some background to this chart, in June of 2016, the Fair Funding Formula was enacted in Pennsylvania that aimed to address the disparities that exist between rich and poor school districts. This new legislation required all new education funding to be distributed using this new formula, which takes into account each district's distinct needs, things like the number of children living in poverty, the number of English language learners, and the overall wealth of the school district. So in this graph, we show the distribution of new funding this year based on the number of children living in poverty within each district. So we broke up the 500 school districts into 4 groups. The bar on the left of the chart, which is number 1, are those districts with the highest number of kids in poverty, and number 4 is the least number of kids in poverty. So as you can see, funding per student is greater with the new funds in high poverty districts. Next slide. So while this legislation was critical to beginning to make our school funding more equitable, it's important to note that the Fair Funding Formula only applies to new education funding since 2014. So this graph shows the portion each year of basic education funding going through the Fair Funding Formula, and that's the part of the bars in light blue. So even with the $100 million increase in education funding that the governor proposed this year, it's important to keep in mind that only 9.7 of the total line item in 2018-19 would go through the formula. Next slide. So another way to think about this inequity is to look at existing per student funding versus what is needed to ensure all students across the state can get an adequate education. So in this graph, we use data from the Public Interest Law Center, who conducted research to figure out how much state funding all schools need to properly educate their students, what they called the state adequacy cost. So in this graph, we divided up the 500 school districts again by number of students living in poverty. 1 is high poverty districts and 4 is low poverty districts. This shows the per student funding needed in each quartile to reach adequacy. So as you can see, funding needed to reach adequacy is much greater for those in school districts with higher levels of child poverty. So this is just to say that there's still a huge gap between existing funding and what is needed to adequately fund our schools, and this gap is greatest for those districts with the most number of kids living in poverty. Next slide. The governor has also proposed an additional $20 million for special education. This follows an increase of $75 million over the last 3 years. Next slide. Another key focus of the governor's budget is on early childhood education. Pre-K counts would see an increase of $30 million. And this is a program that was started in 2007 and provides no-cost pre-K to children in families living in poverty. Funding for this program comes entirely from the state. Head Start is a program primarily funded by federal dollars, but the Head Start supplemental assistance provides additional funding from the state for the program. This would see an additional $10 million in state funding. And overall, the $40 million increase would allow an additional 4,400 kids to be served under these programs. Next slide. So this graph shows pre-K funding since 2010-11. The governor's proposal would increase pre-K funding by 18% this year. And this year's proposal would nearly double the amount of state funding available for pre-K since 2014 and 15. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to talk a bit about higher education. Next slide. So just as some context, as this chart shows, Pennsylvania has poor rankings for higher education funding. Pennsylvania ranks 47th out of 50 states for per capita investment in higher education. You can see Pennsylvania at the bottom of the chart. Our state spends about $132 per capita, which is much below the national average of $259 per capita. And as we've shown in some of our recent research on higher education, this low state investment leads to higher tuition and costs for Pennsylvania families and students. Our state ranked 3rd highest in the nation for in-state tuition and fees for public 4-year colleges and universities. And this obviously weighs heavily on students. In fact, Pennsylvania graduates face the 2nd highest average student debt in the nation. Next slide. So despite efforts by the governor to more boldly increase the higher education budget since he took office, the General Assembly has overwhelmingly rejected these efforts. Since 2014 and 15, funding for higher ed has increased by only 3.4%. And by comparison, Governor Corbett cut higher education in 2011-12 by 17%. As you can see in this graph, funding for higher ed, which is in blue, remains significantly below the levels it was funded at in 2010-11 and before. Today, the state spends more on corrections than it does on higher ed. This chart shows that in 2011 and 12, state spending for corrections, which is the red line, exceeded what the state was spending on higher ed. Higher education funding has remained pretty flat while spending for corrections has increased steadily over the last 8 years. So this year, under the governor's proposal, the Pennsylvania state system of higher education, which includes 14 state universities, would see an increase of $15 million, while community colleges and state-related universities would be flat funded. Next slide. So now I'm going to walk you through workforce development, which spans proposed increases in multiple departments: the Department of Education, Labor and Industry, and Community and Economic Development. Next slide. So a big part of the governor's budget proposal is around workforce development, and his commitment to increasing funding in this area comes in part from the middle class task force that Governor Wolf had established last year. He proposes an additional $50 million in funding for career and technical education, which has been flat funded for about the last 10 years. This additional money would be an increase of 81%. $10 million of the $50 million would go through the existing career and technical education formula, and $40 million would go towards a new initiative called Pennsylvania Smart, which includes funding for expanding STEM and computer science education, improving access to STEM career pathways, and promoting employer engagement in post-secondary education. Also part of Pennsylvania Smart is a proposal of $10 million for apprenticeship and industry partnerships. $7 million would go towards expanding apprenticeship in the state. Just as some context, 2 years ago, the governor had established for the first time an apprenticeship and training office, which has begun to increase registered apprenticeship opportunities in the state. Since the opening of that office, they've seen an increase of 14.5% of registered apprenticeships. So this funding would go towards kind of furthering these efforts. $3 million would go towards industry partnerships in the state. The governor also proposes to maintain $12 million for a program launched last year called Manufacturing PA, and this supports the manufacturing industry by strengthening career pathways. He also proposes an additional $5 million for Pennsylvania First. This is a program that helps facilitate private capital investment, workforce development, and job creation for businesses expanding or locating in Pennsylvania. So with this investment, the governor projects an additional 3,800 jobs will be created and 14,000 jobs will be retained in Pennsylvania. Next slide. So finally, I'm going to walk through some of the human services budget. Next slide. The governor is proposing a 1.8% increase in general fund spending on human services. More than half of the general fund spending on human services goes to medical assistance and long-term care. The rest of the spending goes towards intellectual disabilities, mental health and substance abuse services, child development, and other human services. The governor proposes again this year, since last year's proposal didn't go through, to merge the Department of Health and the Department of Human Services into one department. And this merger would cut down on fragmentation of programs and streamline processes for families while also saving the state money. Next slide. So now I'm going to walk you through some of the priorities of the governor in human services. First is related to childcare. The governor proposes an increase of $25 million in state funds for childcare with a $5 million match from federal dollars. This would provide an additional 1,600 children and families with access to quality care, improve the STARS rating system, and also provide money for a pilot program aimed at improving access to care for infants and toddlers. Also, the governor proposes $1.2 million increase for nurse-family partnerships so that the rates can increase for providers in order to retain high-quality staff. Next slide. Another focus of the governor's this year is fighting the opioid epidemic. This includes federal dollars to the Department of Drug and Alcohol for programs aimed at expanding access to treatment and support, $2 million to continue last year's efforts to increase the number of accredited specialty drug courts, and $4.5 million to train service providers on evidence-based home visiting models. Next slide. Another focus of the governor is increased funding for services for individuals with intellectual disabilities and autism. This includes an array of services for individuals of all ages, serving folks in their own home, in residential facilities, or living with family members. The governor proposes an increase of 2.25% in intellectual disabilities. $16 million of funds would go towards new initiatives, including to help individuals transitioning out of high school special education and into adult services, It would also expand home and community-based services to 100 individuals who are currently on the wait list. It would support 40 individuals entering the adult community autism program and 25 individuals moving from state centers into community programs. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Marc to wrap up.
So I'm just going to say something about one last area in which the government operates, the environmental protection. Next slide. Sadly, at a time when the demands on the Department of Environmental Protection has been increasing so much because of natural gas fracking, there have been massive cutbacks in the agency, from $220 million in 2007-2008 to $125 million in 2012-13, with slow increases since. The governor does propose a much bigger increase this year that will enable the department to add a lot of new staff. I think about 30 new staff people are proposed to be added to the department. And that's going to do two things. One, it's going to make it possible to do more frequent environmental inspections than we have been doing. And also, it will make the permitting process go faster. You remember last year, when in the process of trying to pass a severance tax, the natural gas drillers were saying, well, we can't get our permits processed. And, the governor, and so we should set up a process where they're done, almost automatically. And the governor responded rightly that no, they shouldn't be done automatically, but what we should be doing is putting a little more money into the Department of Environmental Protection so that we have the folks available to do this work in a timely manner. So that's what the governor's proposing, and we'll see whether the General Assembly is willing to accept that proposal. Next slide. Couple of other commitments we want to make mention of by the governor. One is to raise the minimum wage. The proposal is to raise the minimum wage immediately to $12 an hour. The governor's staff has said that they'd like also to see it increased for inflation. This has important budgetary consequences in two ways. One is it reduces spending by about $100 million because human service spending, particularly for Medicaid, would be reduced if Pennsylvanians are making a higher wage. And second, it brings in more money, $100 million there as well, roughly, in revenues for people paying income and sales taxes as a result of having higher wages. There's also a proposal to raise overtime pay to basically do what Obama did and saying, let's raise the threshold under which salaried workers must be paid overtime pay. It hasn't been raised in a number of years, and this would raise wages for a lot of Pennsylvanians. And finally, there's a proposal to create an earned sick leave program for the state. And we'll be talking more about that later in the year, but it's another important initiative. That one doesn't have consequences for the budget, but certainly raising the minimum wage and raising overtime pay will, because as wages go up, state revenues go up as well. And we should add that this is an important component of the budget because, as I said, $200 million is saved, or rather, the budget deficit is reduced by $200 million when we raise the minimum wage. If the General Assembly does not follow through on that, they're going to have to find other ways of balancing the budget. So that brings us to the end. Next slide. I just want to sum up in two ways. And first say, the priorities of this budget are clear and we think appropriate. There's new investments in educational levels, new investments in workforce training, really major initiatives there. New investments in some critical human services and in protecting the environment. And this budget culminates 3 years of some major achievements by the governor. We've reduced the structural deficit through efficiencies and spending restraint, not really through raising general broad-based taxes. We're meeting our pension obligations and paying down the unfunded debt. Finally, we've restored the education cuts that were so terrible in the Corbett years, and we've made some major investments in human services. Next slide. There's still, however, some major problems that the state faces. And it's, in some ways, it's really more important from our perspective to be talking about the public investment deficit rather than the budget deficit. As Diana pointed out, we need $3 to $4 billion a year to equitably and adequately fund our schools, our K-12 schools. We've proposed $1 billion plan to reduce tuition for higher education and to provide more funds for workforce training beyond what the governor's proposed. In human services, there are deep needs that are not being met. We can expect Medicaid costs to increase as the population ages. We're not providing adequate services for many with physical and intellectual disabilities and mental health issues. There are long waiting lists for services. We know there's an opioid crisis that's made the demands for those services increases substantially. And we're not adequately paying human service providers. In many areas, rates for what we pay human service providers has not gone up in many years. We have deep infrastructure needs. Roads and bridges need repair or replacement. Public transit systems are underfunded. Water and sewer systems, something people don't talk about very much in the state, but they're breaking down in some places, and we need public funds to repair them. And we also need public funds for selected property tax relief. We know that while this is not a broad statewide problem, there are areas of the state where property taxes really are far too high, and where selected public investments to reduce them would be very much welcome. So there's a long list of critical public investment needs, and that's what we call our public investment deficit. The future prosperity of the state really depends on meeting those needs. The future prosperity for many young people in the state depends on meeting these needs. Whether our communities thrive or not depends on meeting these needs, and we're not going to be able to meet them without new revenues in the future. Next slide. And that's really the question that voters are going to decide in the November election. We are a nonpartisan organization. We don't tell people who to vote for, but we certainly can say that it's time for the voters to focus on this conflict within Harrisburg, the debate between those who say all we need to do is cut taxes and cut spending, and those who say we really need new revenues so we can expand public investments to create the prosperity we all want. Our view is that regardless of party, it's that latter idea, that public investment is critical to the future of Pennsylvanians, that we think should be uppermost in the minds of voters come November.